Hello again, friends. So, in this clip, we're talking about Patricia Churchland's chapter 7, From Touching a Nerve. So, in that chapter, she's considering issues about free will. Now, the big picture for Churchland is this. We haven't made much headway on the notion of free will, right? Philosophers have talked about it for a long time, for like the last 2,400 years, give or take. We haven't made a whole lot of headway on it. So, perhaps what we can do is shift the focus of discussion. Because if we shift the focus of discussion, then that might illuminate a way of thinking about the things we want to think about that we think about when we think of free will. Weird sentence, I'll come back to it in a second. But in a more tractable or more doable fashion. So, she says that actually the way in which to shift the discussion is to shift discussion from free will to talk of self-control. So, why do we do that? Well, we'll get to that in a few minutes. But she also wants to answer the question of why we should bother talking about all this stuff in the first place. I mean, because after all, we don't really worry about free will in the animal kingdom, so why should we worry about free will in the human kingdom? Well, and her answer is that it's in our social interest to have it's in our social interest to hold individuals responsible for the things that they do. So let's take this on a piece at a time. So the first bit, that since we haven't made much headway on the idea of free will or how we can be free and yet science tell us everything there is interesting to know about us, what do we do, right? What do we do here? Well, since Churchland, as you have seen from the things that we've read so far by her, Churchland is a very strong advocate for appealing to the neurosciences, more broadly to the sciences, right, to biology. And that through a careful study of biology, we can learn everything there is to know about what it is to be human. So, in line with that, she says, well, what can we learn from biology about free will? Well, one way to think about it is to say that what biology tells us is that we have no free will, right? That all of our behavior is determined. In fact, some folks recently have come out, some neuroscientists recently have come out and said that free will is just an illusion, right? That there really is no such thing as free will. In fact, Daniel Wegner, he said, so he's not a biologist, but he's a psychologist at Harvard, recently-ish said that, wrote a book called The Illusion of Self-Consciousness, right? And part of that is the illusion of free will, right? We think we're free. We have this feeling that we're free, but really that feeling is illusory. Now, that's one way of scientifically addressing the issue of free will. Right? So one way to do it is just to say, well, free will doesn't appear as a biological category, it doesn't appear as a chemical category, so it's just all got to be nonsense, right? We just chuck it out the window. But Churchland doesn't go that route. Right? Why doesn't she go that route? Well, because in a way it's perfectly obvious that there's something valuable for us in the idea of free will, right? The idea of choice. And so we don't want to just chuck the idea of choice and chuck the idea of free will without seeing what's good in it, right? We don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So what does the idea of choice do for us, right? Like, what does the concept of free will do for us? Well, one of the things it does for us is it allows us to think about notions like responsibility, right? Holding people accountable for their actions. Why do we like to do that? Why is that a good thing? Well, it's, in a sense, it's in our social interest to hold people accountable for their actions, to hold people responsible for their actions. Because when we hold them responsible for their actions, that is, when we're able to, in a sense, tag people as responsible for the things that we do, that they do, we're able to identify certain people as folks we don't want just milling about in the general population. So, the idea of responsibility, which seems like a natural outgrowth of the idea of free will, allows us to identify the people that we want imprisoned, right? So, so somebody robs a bank, we tag them as responsible for doing that, and when they get that tag, that is a sign to us that they need to be separated from the rest of the population, right? And that's just what we do when we imprison people. So, unlike somebody like Wegener, right, Daniel Wegener, or some other neurobiologists and psychologists, Churchland doesn't want to just chuck the idea of free will because she sees that the concept of free will has done some good for us. So the question, though, is, or rather, we see that the idea of free will does us some good. The problem is that the idea of free will seems to be an intractable one, right? That we've thought up new clever thought experiments like Frankfurt, right? And we've distinguished among kinds of free will that we want to talk about, like freedom of action versus freedom of will. But really, we're no closer to a solution to the problem of free will and determinism than Plato was, or Aristotle, or Socrates, the Stoics. Right? We're no closer to an answer now than any of those dudes were. So we know that science progresses, right? We know that scientific theories change, and that new theories take the place of old theories, and that there's, in a sense, a constant march forward. So, the hunch from Churchland is that if we can somehow graft questions of free will onto scientifically understandable concepts, then we're in a good position to make some headway in ideas or in understanding what it is to act freely. So, Churchland's idea here is that we replace the idea of free action, of free will, with the idea of self-control. So, first thing is, right, so we have two questions right away. Why think that free will and self-control can be paired up like that? That's the first one. And the second one is, why does self-control, or what does self-control have as in its concept that makes it biologically tractable relative to free will, right? What makes it a problem that we can solve? Okay, so first question first. Why connect free will and self-control? Well, the idea, so Churchland doesn't offer a formal argument on this front, but in a sense it's kind of intuitive. If we recognize somebody as acting with self-control, then we recognize them as stopping themselves from acting in certain ways. So, for example, there's this delightful marshmallow experiment that they do with kids. So what they do is they set kids down at a table and they put a marshmallow, like just regular old delicious marshmallow, right in front of them. And they say to these kids, I'm going to leave the room for 20 minutes. You can either eat this marshmallow, or you can wait the 20 minutes, and if you wait the 20 minutes, I'll give you another marshmallow. And so then the researchers, the psychologists leave the room, and, to see what happens. And so some of the kids are able to resist temptation, and they hold off on eating the marshmallow, and the researcher comes back, and they get an extra marshmallow. But some of the kids can't resist temptation. If you get a chance, go onto YouTube and Google like marshmallow experiment, and search for marshmallow experiment. It'll have clips of what kids do to stop themselves from eating the marshmallow, and some of them are pretty hilarious. So there you go. If you have nothing better to do on a Friday night, you're welcome, friends. So free will seems to have a kind of obvious connection with the idea of self-control. That is, if you have self-control, then you can exhibit a kind of ability for when to act and when not to act. So for those kids who resisted temptation to eat that marshmallow that was right in front of them, they were exhibiting self-control. And we say of those kids that they could have eaten that marshmallow, but they didn't. They chose, we might say, they chose to hold off on eating that marshmallow. So there seems to be kind of an intimate relationship between free will and self-control. Right? So why pair these two ideas together? Because on the face of it, they seem really closely related. So now we get to the second question. Why self-control? Why should we think that focusing on self-control instead of free will can get us any closer to understanding, choice in human activity? Well, because we know that self-control is something that appears outside of human beings. So we get the example that Churchland gives us of the bear and the caribou, right? The bear has to lure the caribou out into the stream, and once it's out in the water, then the bear is able to take down the caribou. So we see then that the bear has a great deal of self-control, right? It doesn't just try to attack the caribou right away, because if the bear does that, it's going to lose. Right? So the bear has to lure the caribou into a vulnerable spot and can then make the attack. That's very much like kids holding off on eating the one marshmallow in order to get 2 marshmallows. So we know that non-human animals exhibit self-control, and self-control seems closely allied to our idea of free will, and so we can replace study of free will with study of self-control. Furthermore, we are getting an understanding of the neural mechanisms involved with self-control. So Churchland points out that the prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia, and nucleus accumbens are all neural structures that are part of self-control, right? Of when living organisms show self-control. So we already have some headway in understanding what it is to demonstrate self-control. So what we're left with on Churchland's picture is we're left with a biologically tractable idea, right? No longer are we just thinking abstractly about free will and speculating when people act freely and when they don't act freely. I mean, again, think back to the Jones cases from Frankfurt's piece, right? So we considered Jones in a variety of scenarios. And for each one of those scenarios, we relied on our intuition. When we got to the third scenario, when things got really tricky, so that was the one where Jones decided to rob the bank, and then he was threatened with assault if he failed to rob the bank. And he recognizes that had he not already chosen to rob the bank, then he would change his mind to rob the bank, right? Then he would have changed his mind in a scenario where he hadn't chosen to rob the bank, right? So because he's chosen to rob the bank, he doesn't need to change his mind. But if he hadn't chosen to rob the bank, then he would change his mind in light of the threat. And so we asked in that case, is Jones coerced? And so on the discussion boards, some of you all said, yes, kind of is, kind of not clear. And that's exactly Frankfurt's conclusion, right? As you saw in the text, and as I mentioned in the last in that lecture, it's not clear whether or not it's just not clear whether Jones was coerced. So rather than relying on our intuitions to determine free will and coercion, we rather rely on incoming data from the sciences. Right? Instead of just saying, I think I'm free here, or I'm pretty sure this guy was coerced, we can instead say, well, what's going on in the prefrontal cortex? What's happening in the basal ganglia? What's going on in the nucleus accumbens? And so we thereby make difficult, abstract, philosophical questions more like biological questions. And we can make progress on biological questions. And so that gives us the prospect of making progress on difficult philosophical questions as well. So, the broad overview for both Churchland and Pereboom, to sum up the last two lectures, is that Pereboom wants to retain some of our ordinary moral ideas about right and wrong action, right? And yet, but still be a determinist, right? So he sort of tweaks with our ideas about responsibility, praise and blame to do that. For Churchland wants to replace talk of free will with talk of self-control. And by doing that, we can make progress on understanding what free will is. Now, one point that I mentioned about Churchland that I just want to sort of put here at the end as a little coda, a little footnote, is that Churchland holds that it's in our social interests to identify people as responsible for their actions. And this is, by the way, something that both Churchland and Pereboom have in common. Pereboom mentions this in some other work, but I want to mention here in connection with both Pereboom and Churchland. So we think about imprisoning people who are wrongdoers, right? So if you rob a bank, presumably you go to prison. Now, if we get rid of our ordinary ideas of free will, then what justifies us in doing that? Well, it's largely a practical point. Namely, we don't want people who do things like rob banks or hurt other people. We don't want them just running around. And so we put them in prison to make sure that nobody else is hurt. So you might think to yourself, well, but still, they didn't choose that action. So why are we justified in sticking them in prison, right? What gives us that power, right? What justifies our doing things? And at this point, Pereboom brings in an analogy. Again, not in the reading we did, in some other work, but it's an analogy that really illuminates aspects of his philosophy as well as Churchland's. He says, think about when we quarantine people for an illness. When we quarantine people for an illness, they don't ever ask to get sick, right? They don't ask for that illness, nor do they ask to be quarantined, nor do they even deserve quarantine, right? Deserve to be quarantined. They're quarantined because they have this illness. And if we fail to quarantine those people, then that's bad news for the rest of us. So there's nothing these folks do to merit being quarantined, and yet we quarantine them for the good of society as a whole. It's the same thing with imprisoning criminals. They don't merit being imprisoned. They didn't do anything to deserve being imprisoned. They didn't choose anything to deserve being imprisoned. But we imprison them for the good of society as a whole. So just as the person with, swine flu is quarantined even though they did nothing to merit it, even though they did nothing to deserve it. In the same way, the person who commits violent crimes is imprisoned even though he or she didn't do anything to deserve it. And so we justify our practices of imprisoning people by appeal to social safety, but not by appeal to anything about the individual agent doing the action.